Matter of fact, I'm more nervous now than what I was talking to the students at Wollongong High the other day. But I'll just tell it as I experienced it. You know, the shoes are pinching a bit, and just kick them off and relax and make me feel at home. But just a little family background. I think in this year, the 50th year, we've been asked to remember some of the things that happened and some of the things that gave us the freedom that we've enjoyed so much today. So I want to backtrack a little bit. And Mum and Dad were born in England, did their training in the London Salvation Army Training College before World War I. Dad went to France and there unfortunately lost his brother. And after the war, they came out to Sydney, working in the Salvation Army. And as Jacob mentioned, the boys' home and those who remember the People's Palace in Pitt Street. And we went to Gosford, Wyoming, where I was born with a twin brother. And then the war came, and we felt that we ought to do something for the old country. I've always appreciated the love and the discipline that my parents applied to us. It was rigid, it was tough, and the discipline and skill was great, because that was one of the reasons why I'm able to stand here today, because of the love and discipline and the order that discipline gives you in respect to people's property, to a point of view. And we're also taught to honour God in Sunday school, honour our King and our country and the flag that we love so much. There's a wise old saying, and as often has happened, he who forgets the past is bound to repeat it. He who forgets the past is bound to repeat it. And once again, in a short space of time, we found ourselves in war against Germany. And apparently Hitler forgot to read the historic facts of World War I. Apparently he thought he was going to ignore that and change the situation. But history did repeat itself, and Germany was soundly defeated. Freedom is one of the most precious things you and I have. For if you lose it, you've lost everything. Doesn't matter whether you're a millionaire or what it is, and that happened during the war. Many people lost their property. But you lose the right to do what you want to do. The Japanese were not a signatory to the Geneva Convention, so it didn't matter to them. And it's true to say that you don't realise the value of a thing until you've lost it. And if all of us, for example, were suddenly to be picked up and trucked away to an unknown destination and locked up with no instructions of where we might go or where we finish up, we would suddenly realise that we've lost our freedom and what freedom really means. Down through the pages of history, God has always provided the leader of his choice, and it was so in World War II. I, growing up as a boy, loved the stories of Gallipoli, France. Never missed an ANZAC day. When we were kids, his dad would take us down to the cenotaph. Loved to hear the stories of some of those who were in Gallipoli, and they have been embedded in my mind all my life. And when war was declared, it seems an unusual thing, isn't it, that when there's a situation beyond our control, we call for divine help. And those of us can remember the churches were packed on a Sunday. It was hard to get a place. There were many miracles that took place during the war, and I can't mention many of those, but it's a natural thing for those who are in trouble, who are in a situation, to pray to God. And I've said that to the students at Wollongong High the other day. It is a perfectly natural thing, and I said that no doubt in some time in the future they will be in a situation when all help is gone for them, and they in turn will ask for divine help. Who can remember on the 3rd of September 1939 when King George VI, Queen Mother's late husband, and this is what he said: I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, "Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way." I never forgot that. And that was an encouragement, wasn't it? For the people of the British Empire facing the unknown. Not to put your trust in man, but put your trust in God. One of our sons gave me an autobiography of Churchill, and I've been a great lover of Churchill as a boy and during the war. And when he was 16 years old, he said to a friend at school, he wasn't much of a scholar, but he said, "I can see further into the future than you. England will be invaded. I do not know by whom, but I shall be in command of the defences of London, and I shall save London and England from disaster." And 50 years later, in 1940, he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And when he rallied the nation in 1940, and I think France had fallen, we'll never surrender, we'll fight them on the beaches, etc., etc., he finished up with this important statement. He said, "It is God who in his good time will give us the victory." Now, on soldiers' grave in Burma are these words. "When you go home, tell them of us and say, we gave our tomorrow for your today." And I want to speak for all, especially Australians of the 8th Division, who did so much for us and did not return. And we remember them. The Japanese were a brutal nation. They thought, here's the opportunity, with England down on the knees and Germany racing along, here's the time, and now is the time to settle old scores and to take advantage. They had planned it for years, but they started a war that they couldn't finish. And the Emperor had full knowledge of what Japan was doing, because he said to his leaders, Tojo and the others, what will the first 12 months of the war bring? And they said victory. But he said, what after? And they couldn't give him an answer. In the army, strict discipline applies in the Japanese army. It's brutal. Every soldier is told that he must die for the Emperor, and that is the highest honour that he can seek. And to us, to surrender was a disgrace. We were trash, as far as I was concerned. The Allied prisoners who were taken prisoners of war, we should have died according to their belief, and hence that we were treated so badly. The idea of the Japanese was to build a great co-prosperity sphere. Burma, China, Indonesia, Timor, and all around that area. They wanted to dominate that area and put it under the control of the Japanese. But it didn't work out that way. A lot of questions have been raised about Singapore and what happened. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to give you a few pointers. The responsibility for the fall of Singapore really rested on the British government of the 1930s. The Baldwin government, the Ramsay MacDonald government, they were appeasers. They knew that Germany was arming, they knew that Japan was arming, and they did nothing. They rather hoped it would go away. Now, Churchill had been out of office for 10 years, from 1929 to 1939, so he could not be held accountable for the fall of Singapore. As he said, I will accept the responsibility from the time I take office, but I will not accept the responsibility that happened before, or what didn't happen. And he had connections in Germany, and he knew that the German Air Force was racing ahead of the British Air Force. Now, Churchill knew that they were on the warpath. And in those intervening years, which he called the wilderness years, he hounded the Ramsay MacDonald government and Chamberlain, and people were coming to him and saying, Winston, you've got to do something. The Germans are getting ahead of us in air power. And Churchill knew that the future of England depended on a strong air force. So as he said, he could not be blamed for anything that was done, that wasn't done. He said, I had warned them over and over, and to use his old English expression, and none could gainsay me. On Singapore, he said, when he took office, I wasn't told, I didn't know, I should have asked. Now these people in Singapore, the administration lived in a fool's paradise. Planters, 10,000 miles away from England, having a great time, you know, tiffin at raffles and clubs and soccer and rugby union and all that sort of thing, you know. And in the intervening years, the Japanese had been there for years with several thousand agents, such as businessmen, barbers, dentists and all this sort of thing. They had everything worked out. In Malaya, they even cut roads into the plantations. They had timber under the bridges in case they were blown during the war. And still, the administration out here wouldn't listen. The British press built up the idea of Fortress Singapore, as if there was a gun under every tree. And that was false and gave the British people the false impression. And also Australia, the Australian government of the day cannot escape entirely because they were the supporters of the forward defence of Singapore. So what actually happened was in 1937, General Dobby came out from England and surveyed Malaya and Singapore, put a report back to the British government and said that the Japanese will come down the Malayan Peninsula. The requirements for the defence of Singapore were 500 planes, 60,000 frontline troops, strong army navy support to defend the naval base on the island. But nothing was done. So it finished up, we had few tanks, the Prince of Wales and the battleship Repulse was sunk within the matter of a few days after the declaration of war on the 8th of December. And so the defences of the island were practically nil. I stood on a hill in Johor, across the Straits of Johor, and watched the bombs fall on Singapore the first night. All the lights were on and they were partying and having a good time, you know, and they just didn't realise and just didn't think. And even towards the end of the battle for Singapore, there were those who still believed, miraculously, I don't know how, that Singapore wouldn't fall. Now the Australians were criticised, but gave a great account of themselves during the 10 weeks of fighting. They are the only ones that won the VC during the Malayan campaign. They were the first to experience an atrocity by the Japanese in combat. So it was on for young and old. They knew exactly how many days it would take to take Singapore. Now the Australians had this section here, our brigade, the 27th Brigade, from the causeway here, this area here was far too thinly spread. Percival made the mistake of having most of the British troops over here. I don't know why he thought they'd come that way, but they didn't. They came across here, straight down the causeway and into Singapore. Heavy fighting ensued, and during the fighting there, the Japanese went into the Alexandria Hospital and shot the doctors, patients, and about 80 orderlies during the course of the fighting. There was no consideration, the Red Cross didn't mean a thing. And I was with the battalion here, and a lot of us got hit on a place called Bandai Village on the early hours on the Monday morning, and we were coming out. I was lucky, we came out on the first ambulance, and the second ambulance got a direct hit. So we came down to the town here to a place called Oldham Hall, which was a converted girls' high school, and that's where we first met the Australian nurses from the 2nd 10th AGH. They came down the ward, they were marvellous, shelling the hospital, they had patients down the street, in the houses, and when the shells had come over, they'd duck like this, but no patient was ever left uncared for. But then on the Tuesday, they came down and said to us, we've got to go. They want us to leave, and some of them cried, and one nurse said to me, she said, will you pray for us? And to this day, and I still regret it, I never asked her name. I don't know whether she made it or not. And so they were taken away and came down into Singapore Harbour. All the people were pushed back into the city, about 1 million. They were shelling indiscriminately theatres, houses, hospitals, women and children were being killed. The supply for Singapore was over in Johor here, and the Japanese cut it off, so there was no wood in the hospitals. And we were squeezed into a corner. And actually, the longer it went on, probably the worse it could have got. And so what happened was, just tracking away back to the nurses, they went down to St Andrew's Cathedral there and waited, and they boarded 2 boats, one the Empire Star, which got home safely, and one the Vyner Brooke. And there was about 200 on it. But here's one of the tragedies. Down at Java, Sumatra Java, is what they call the Sunda Straits. The Japanese Navy had blocked the Sunda Straits, which no ships could get out. That was on the 10th of February 1942. The Dutch Navy sent a message to Singapore Admiralty to say the straits were blocked, but that no ships should proceed. And there was nobody there to decipher the message. And 44 ships sailed on the 11th, and most of them were sunk on the 13th of February, on the Friday, just before. And it was a shocking mistake, and that's the sort of thing that happened quite a bit during the war. But I want to talk about Margot Turner. She was on one of the ships, an English nurse, and survived the prison camp, and made a dame and so on. But she was on the convoy, and her and a friend, when the ship was sunk, they put 2 rafts together in which there were 16 people, 6 children, 2 under 1. And within 2 or 3 days, all the women had died, and the children were left. And one by one, the little ones died, and Margot just laid them gently into the sea. And she was on her own for 4 days on the raft. She was burnt black, and eventually was picked up by a destroyer. She was hauled onto the destroyer by rope, and fortunately the Japanese doctor spoke English and was a gentleman. He looked after her, bathed the wounds, changed the clothes, see that she was fitted out properly, and did that for 2 or 3 days. Then he said, I've got to put you ashore at a place called Muntok in Sumatra. So he had to put her ashore, and on the last visit to her, he brought her clothes neatly pressed on a coat hanger and handed them to her, and there he said goodbye. And Margot said she thought that was a great act of kindness. Now I want to go back to Singapore, and on the Sunday, it was quiet. 8:30, everything was quiet. There were those who cried because the war was finished, those who wondered why there had been lack of support and didn't understand why. There were those who wanted to go on with it, but we were ordered to surrender, and we had no choice. And so at 8:30 it was quiet, and as a prisoner of war I was determined to survive no matter what happened, never to give up. I had faith in God and in Prime Minister Winston Churchill that old England, with all the history, would win in the end. And she did. She did. This is called the Scrounging Barracks, formerly occupied by the Gordon Highlanders. They were garrison troops, and they lived a life of luxury. We arrived there in August 1941. They were having their morning parade at 9 o'clock, getting into their slacks and going on leave in Singapore. Now that was the attitude. And we were training our insides out. So anyhow, but that's, Changi goes right down to the sea. All this area was, the hospitals were over here, and further on was the English prison camp. And the reason why it would have taken too much Japanese administration to look after all the prisoners, so a colonel was appointed for the Australians, a colonel for the English, and they were responsible to Jap headquarters, who in turn would pass orders to us, to the rest of the soldiers, and so the instructions were carried out there. I lived in here, 2 or 3 of these places here, the last one down here. I was working there cutting wood for the cookhouse. And some of the troops went into Singapore and were on working parties, and that's when we first felt the pain of hunger. You ever gone home, you know, and say, boy, gee, I feel a bit peckish, and you go to the fridge? Well, that pain is there all the time. And your stomach shrinks to a certain degree, but all your waking days, you're thinking about food. I was just thinking about that trifle tonight. When we got talking, we often talk about what was our favourite dish. Mine was baked rabbit with the trimmings and trifle. Every time, they're the 2 dishes. But the pain is still there, and it's a constant nagging pain. And it's very hard to avoid it. So what happened? A couple of important events took place here. The accommodation was about 3 floors there, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And working parties went out. We had a big Chinese Changi vegetable garden there where we worked. And there was a lot of money in the camp at the time. Some of the banks had been blown up and the boys raided them. And there was 2 up. And the Japs were playing 2 up, doing their money, but they didn't seem to be worried about it. We had a concert party there, which was excellent, and same with the British. And all that part was part of morale building. We had the Changi University, which was here. You could learn practically any subject in the world, Changi. All this took place in 1942 because we didn't know what the future held. But then an important thing happened. The Japanese wanted us to sign a non-escape form that we wouldn't escape. So they brought all the British soldiers from over there and over here, something like 15,000 of us, and put us into that area there. Now they're not all there at the moment. They're out doing various jobs. But we were there for 4 days. No surrender, no escape. And our authorities were arguing with the Japs that we don't have the right to sign that form because we would forfeit our pay and entitlements. So after the 4th day, 2 Australians who had attempted to escape and 2 English soldiers had attempted to escape were taken down to Changi Beach and shot. Now after that then, we all signed these pieces of paper. Some signed Ned Kelly, Bob Menzies. you know the Australians, don't you? Well, anyhow, the Japs were satisfied that they'd scored the point. And so that's actually what happened. But the officer who was responsible for that shooting after the war, he was taken down blindfolded and shot in Changi Beach in the same place. Now, the Australians have a reputation for scroungers, thieving things. Pretty good at it, they are. And those who were on the working parties had access to warehouses where there was food. There was a great stock of food, while the British were there. And they were stealing petrol from the Japs and selling it to the Chinese. And the Chinese were bringing medical supplies to our hospitals, and we owe a lot to them. And of course, everybody was trying to supplement the poor rice diet, and that rice in the early days was a bit like this. Now there's 13 ounces of rice, a bit soggy, and that's how it was soggy. And they gave us some boiled grass to eat with it in the early days, and that didn't go down too well. But could you manage on that 3 times a day or less? There's 13 ounces of rice. So one day they got into the Nestle's warehouse and they were pitching condensed milk. And the Jap officer heard about it and he thought he'd have a word with the Australians. So he drives up in his staff car, pennant flying, they love that, all that sort of business. Got himself in a position where he could stand over the troops because they're all so little, they have to level them. And he said, now I know what you Australians are doing. He said, you're pinching condensed milk from Nestle's factory. So he puts the tin of condensed milk down there. And the Australian hat is very large. You can put cigarettes in the van, and he knew that the boys were putting things under their hats and getting things into the camp. But the Japs couldn't figure out why. They were a bit, slow sometimes. So anyhow, he took the condensed milk down, he put it down, covered it up to make the point with the Australian hat. And then he proceeded to say, now, I know about the petrol. I know that you said you're stealing the petrol and selling to the Chinese. And he said, that has got to stop. So when he'd finished chatting on and telling us what he wanted, he thought he'd demonstrate the point in relation to the condensed milk. He picked the hat up, but the tin of condensed milk wasn't there. In disgust, he hopped into the staff car, drove down the street, only went about 100 yards and ran out of petrol. The boys had milked the tank. And then, with the water bottles, they'd cut them in halves, put a false bottom in, water in the top, and then cigars or things, cheroots and all that sort of thing, whatever they could scrounge. And then they would do some stupid things. If you stole a tin of jam, say £5 tin of jam, they'd make you eat the lot. Oh. And then they would bash for any given reason. And then give you all, might punish you for 24 hours, then give you all the food and cigarettes you can eat. Smoke. Unpredictable. I often felt they were like monkeys. You never knew when they were going to spring. But anyhow, that was 1942, and I personally finished up with a bad case of appendicitis and finished up in the Roberts Hospital in Changi there, and I spent 6 weeks in bed and reading that great old story, How Green Was My Valley by Richard Llewellyn. But things were to change. And then the rumours began about the big Project North, land of milk and honey, take all your gear, you know, easy conditions, better pay and all that sort of thing. And that's when we come to the journey of the railway. So we were shipped from, there were 3 forces, F Force, my friends over here, they were on F Force, a bit further up than us, F Force, D Force and H Force. Now the purpose of the railway in Burma was to supply the Japanese army in Burma, because the Americans were squeezing the sea lanes, and that's the alternative they had. But I want to go back a bit, and one important thing. My mother and dad, but Mum, had tremendous faith in God. And our first letter cards we got in April 1943, and this is what it said. God has promised to bring you safely home. It is a trial of our patience and faith that He will not fail us. I have to say, the timing. It wasn't only a couple of weeks after that we were on our way, and who would have guessed that within 8 months of that year, most of us would be dead. And I read that letter over and over again, many times, holding on to the promise that God is able in all circumstances. And so we travelled on this rice trucks here, about 30 to the truck. You can see the boys taking turns standing there. There are 30 men inside there. They're taking turns getting a bit of fresh air. Took 4 days from Singapore to Bangkok. Occasional stops for toilet and a bucket of rice if you're fortunate enough to get any rice. Sometimes we went without water. But we're just like cattle, and in the hot conditions it was very hard to take. The cost in lives for the building of the railway were 13,000 Allied soldiers, 46 Australians, and estimated 200,000 Asians. And here we'd be trained at a little place called Bampong. We were up there in 1992. Now it's a big station and a very big town, and we all detrained there a mile or so down the road, and then the Japs ordered us, and I'm speaking about our force now, H Force. There were 600 of us, and most of them were unfit before we left Changi. So we laid all our gear out, and the Japanese went in and took whatever they wanted. Now some of the boys started selling things, and the Thais said to us, you may as well sell all that you have, because most of you won't be coming back. And that's true. So we had about 100 miles to go. With the results, a lot of the chaps started to collapse and with sore feet and so on. And having arrived at this place called Kenyu, and I'll just show it on the map, Hellfire Pass, that is now the official memorial, and all these places represent other camps up there. So when we got there, it was virgin jungle. We had 2 days to clear a camp. The Japs supplied a few tents, shocking conditions, and they wanted them back at work and into Hellfire Pass. Oh, that's just some of the Australians carrying some sleepers there. You can see that there. See, some of them have got bare feet, and some of them were working in the quarries and cuttings, and their feet were like squashed tomatoes. They suffered very cholera, and the losses were enormous. Now here's a bridge here, and I think it's probably about 100 foot high, and it says here that from getting this after months of starvation, had to crawl on their hands and knees across the bridge for fear of falling into the valley below. There were bridges like that in which many prisoners lost their lives. Now this is a hut, or typical type of hut that some of us had, and some of them didn't have any roofs on. They slept in the monsoons and the pouring rain and had to go to work and had to eat sometimes less than 13 ounces a day. And is it any wonder that their bodies broke down and they began to suffer great hardship? And that embankment there, I saw the English working on that early in the piece, and that was cut out in the virgin jungle, and all picked up in little coolie baskets and just packed down there. That was the embankment. And hundreds and hundreds of English soldiers lost their lives there. Now here's 3 fit men. Most of us who are in the various camps were like that. This chap has a swollen stomach here because he can't do his short stuff. That's berry. There's wet berry and dry berry. And once the body breaks down, there's no end to it. It just falls down and is susceptible to all sorts of things. But the Japanese demanded, they wanted 200 men next day for the work, wherever it was, they wanted 200. And there'd be arguments with the doctors, and doctors were bashed and ill-treated, and that went in the main right through the whole of the railway until it was finished. They treated every prisoner of war as a unit in a great machine. There were 5,000 prisoners, there were 5,000 units in that machine. And if 200 of those units died or failed or were sick, they wanted them replaced the next day or whatever the requirement was. Now here's an ulcer. Because of our rundown condition, and our friends have had them and we know what they're like, it could be size of a 10-cent piece during the night, and next morning it's like that. Now there were over 200 amputations through the prison, by prisoners, and I had one on the ankle here, and it was small by the comparison, but it required 2 operations, and our friend over there, he had a couple of operations on them too. But how can I describe the pain? Just like if somebody's got a red hot iron and burning into your system. It's agonising. And some of them lost whole limbs and shins and all that sort of thing, and quite a lot lost their lives. Now the camp that we were was a couple of miles from Hellfire Pass. There's Hellfire Pass, the memorial, official memorial now. And our camp was a couple of miles up, and we had to come down the side of the mountain, and we had 68 beaten to death. And within a matter of weeks of our 600, 400 were unfit for work. And we had to climb down the side of the mountain. We had a drill. We'd hammer the holes into the wall here. And then the Japs would put in the dynamite and blow them. And all those pieces of rocks were picked up by hand and put into little coolie baskets into a skip and taken down further along the track to build the embankment. And it rained and rained and rained. In the monsoons, everything was wet, the tents were wet. In our tents there were supposed to be 4, there were 20. Part of the cutting you'll see there, 80 feet high, claimed many prisoners of war. And that was one of the main cuttings on the railway. There was a speedo. It had to be done by October, or actually September 1943. The Japanese wanted to complete the railway. So speedo meant night and day, 24 hours round the clock to get the work done. And many lost their lives in the process. Those who were strong helped the weak. And I have to say here, the Good Samaritan story was carried out over 100 times a day. Men helping their friends, men helping their mates. And before the line reached here, all the supplies, we were up there in 1992, all the supplies came up by river, and going down to where the barges were, it was so steep that you had to hang onto the trees. In the monsoon, you'd slide down the side of the mountain, and railway sleepers, sets of wheels, sets of lines, everything that was required to build that railway was brought up by us, who on the river part, as they called us, when we took our turn and coming up the side of the mountain. But in 1992, we went back there, and it was a great experience. And Joan and 3 of our 4 sons went back, and I stood on Hellfire Pass, somewhat further down, and there was quite a few friends there. And one of the ABC reporters said to me, "What kept you going?" And this is what I said. I remember a particular day standing there near the skip, and we were throwing the rocks over the side of the mountain. And I looked around and I thought, if this keeps up, there won't be many of us left alive. And across the valley, there are these great mountains. And the verse from the 121st Psalm came into my mind. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. From whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord. And that's, I said to the reporter, what kept me going. It was a tremendous struggle. It's a war of body, mind and spirit. In a shooting war, you either get killed or survive and you haven't lost your freedom. But when your life is being wrested from you through starvation and primitive conditions and bashings and beatings, it's the war of the body and the mind and spirit. And it's a tremendous draining thing. And it's a tremendous struggle. But one had to push on and not give in. And there are those, unfortunately, who did, but those who also gave in because they didn't want to be a burden to their mates, rather than let them struggle on. And there was a great spirit there. And so, at the end of October 1943, the railway was finished, and we owe a great deal to the doctors and the orderlies. Without them, the Japanese had medical supplies not far away from our camp available, and this happened everywhere. But they refused to let us have them. So Padre Duckworth from the British Army, I couldn't walk and he carried me on his back down the side of the mountain. And to this day, I don't remember, I remember he putting me down once. Even a bag of spuds gets heavy after a while. And I suppose I would have been about 5 stone like most of the rest of the boys. And he put me in the train, but I don't remember anything else. And we went back along this Wampo viaduct, along here. And you probably remember it used to creak. We had a train over here, and as we were going back down towards Bangkok, and incidentally hundreds of lives were lost there, as we were going back, we could hear the timbers creaking. And most of the boys had smoked because I was a bit nervous. But that's one of the longest bridges, and it's still running today. It's a 4-hour run, been rebuilt, of course. But we rode on that to Bangkok when we were up there in 1992. So we came then back to this hospital camp called Kanburi. Our doctor was in charge of it, and there were thousands of Allied soldiers, prison war, going through that hospital. He was the only surgeon. And it went on day in, day out, night in, night out, operations one after the other. And he was one of God's gentlemen, Kevin Fagan, and he did a tremendous job. And I said to him years after the war, I said, Doc, I want to say something. I said, God always chooses the right man in the right place. And he's quiet for a minute, and he said, the important thing is how we rise to the occasion, isn't it? How we rise to the occasion. And the boys loved him. But then he had a batman at Canberra, and Jimmy Fairbrother, I saw his headstone in 1992 and it came all flashing back. And he'd survived cholera and he came down to the camp with us and I was looking after him. And we chatted about going home and he said, no, he said, I'm not going. And he got dysentery again and he started to run down and I knew that he was going to die, and we got used to it, but I don't think we got callous to the extent that we were careless. Anyhow, I said to the boys, you better get Doc. So we sent for Doc, and I could see him walking along now, the hut, and he put the stethoscope on Jim's heart. And I looked up, and the tears were running down his face. He said, I didn't want him to come. I wanted him to stay in Changi. So about Wednesday, on the Wednesday, it was about 7:30, I said, how you going, my mate? And he said, I've never been so happy. And about 8 o'clock, it's gone. And when I stood at his headstone in 1992, I thought of the 23rd Psalm. I never really understood it till then. I believe it's true. The last verse I like, and Jim is gone, I believe there. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of the life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And I believe it. And those of us who have had that experience surely can't go through it without feeling something like that. Back to Changi. End of 1943, the railway was finished. We were back to Changi. Some of us went to various camps where more food was available. And they got rid of the women and children. They put all the prisoners of war there because the net was getting closer to the Japs. They were getting strangled, and I think they put us there for greater control. So 1944 was, we were building aerodromes there, the Changi Aerodrome, and during the course of that period there, we heard about the landing in France. We had our radio connection in Changi Jail. Even the Japs knew that, but they couldn't find it. And so we knew that D-Day was on, and we were working on the aerodrome, and then came the air raids. November 1944, I was sitting on a committee for Christmas Day, and they were deciding what they were going to have for Christmas Day. And I can say to this, it was amazing, the things that they cooked. I don't know where they got the stuff from, but anyhow, there was cakes and there was rissoles, there was puddings and all this sort of thing. And in the results was we had a good Christmas Day, and we hoped it was to be our last. And what happened was, of course, we all got the trots. The food was too rich for us. So the Jap said, Benjo's the word to go to the toilet. He said, oh, then Benjo. Yeah, I said, well, look, I said, we've had a little bit too much tucker. And it was upsetting us. But another remarkable thing happened for me. And when I was sitting down on a committee, a replied cable came from Mum. And which, and amongst other things, just said, we are very well, don't worry about us, see you soon. And I sent the reply paid back, I said, I'm fighting fit, chin's up, and see you soon. And Mum got that just before Christmas Day 1944. She couldn't have got a better Christmas present, could she? And that, again, you see, God is able. Now, I don't know who handled that cablegram. I don't know how it came, but it did happen. And so at the end of 1944, they started to disperse us around the island in the defence, digging foxholes and all that sort of thing in various groups. And we went to a place called Adam Park, and we were working down there for a while. And we started to get the rumours then that something big was on. You know, the Malays were saying, you know, there had been a lot of bombing, one thing another, and so on. And there was a big conference in 1945 at a school not far from us, and everybody was saying I saw a well-dressed Chinaman who said the war's over and all that sort of thing. But anyhow, our last experience with Japanese were civilians, and let me clear the point here. The civilian soldier, he's a factory worker, he works in the bank, or he's, or sweeps the streets. It had nothing to do with the military side of the story. And the soldiers were different, they were brutal, they were hard trained, and that's the way they acted. But these fellas had never seen a white man before, but eventually they took the guns away, and we ran the job. Now, in Japanese terms, the number one nip is number one, the next nip is number two, and number three. Now, Blinky was called, he was number one, he was called Blinky because he's always blinking his eyes. Bucky was number two because he has teeth that stuck out a bit. Knocker was number three because he was next down the list, and that's how it went. So anyhow, on the 1st of June 1945, it was my birthday was coming up on the 3rd of June, and I said to Knocker, I called him over, I said, come over. And I said, tomorrow, it's my birthday. And he didn't catch on. He looked up at me, he was a jovial bloke, and he looked up, and then I went like that. And then he grinned and he said, birthday. So anyway, I didn't think anything of it. And on the Wednesday, I looked down the street, and here comes Knocker, 2 coconuts around his shoulders, and he came up to me, and a bit of inflation there. Coconuts were 5 cents in 1942 and $10 in 1945. Now, I don't know whether he bought them or he pinched them or what, but anyhow, he brought them up, and he came up to me, and he said, he put them down on the ground and the packet of cereals, and he said, presento. You know what we all say, don't you? You shouldn't have. I didn't have the money. I said, Knocker, I haven't got any money. He said, presento. And so I just bowed and said, arigato. He didn't have to do it. And then the next day we saw Bucky was crying. And we went over and had to talk to him, and he had some photos of his family. And he's worried. I said, what are you crying for, Bucky? And he said, I'm worried about the roads on Tokyo. He said, my family lives in Tokyo. And we didn't have anything against them. They're just civilians doing a job, and they have the same feelings like you and I. And then we used to risk, the boys to take terrible risks in stealing tapioca out of Chinese gardens for those who were sick in the camp. We always tried to help each other, you know, and the run the risk of getting shot or bashed up was always on the cards. And this particular day it was my turn to bring the tapioca into the camp, and I had a great bucket about this size full of tapioca, and my mate Laurie was with me, and they sprung a search on us. Instead of going in the normal entrance to the camp, we came in the back, and they said, search over. And I'm standing in the front line like this, with this great bucket of tapioca. All I had was a haversack and a pork pie hat, and I said, there was 30 of us there, and I said to Lionel, I said, this is it. Now, the Japs have a one-track mind. If their sergeant said, look the haversack, and don't look anywhere else, that's what he did. And sometimes their eyesight was so bad, and I thank God for that, because he never saw. So he went up the line, the first line, and he went up the second line, and my ribs were nearly cracking. My heart was busting. He only had a look at me. And so he did the first line, the third line, and he came down to the front, and he saluted the sergeant and said, all men there, you know, sound you. And then I said to Lionel, I said, get the boys behind me, because I had about 50 yards to go to the hut. Anyhow, we were walking down, and was I glad to sit on the floor when we got to the hut. That's the closest I ever went, closest to getting caught with a bucket of tapioca, because they did some shocking things. But our boys needed it, and the Chinese knew we did it, and we did that to try and help them along as far as food is concerned. But anyhow, getting close to the end now, on the Saturday, we sat down on the parade ground, and 1 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, nothing happened. And then in walked the British paratroopers. And they said, boys, the war's over. But what we want you to do is to stay inside. There's only 6 of us on the island and about 40,000 Japs. He said, just wait until some of the relieving troops come in. And then they said, apart from food, what would you like? And we said, we'd like a radio. So anyhow, they come back with one of those, you know, those old big console radios? Anyhow, a couple of hours, they came back with that, and we sat up at night time, and it was tremendous to hear music and all that sort of thing. And then after a few days, we all shot through into Singapore. I can't remember how I got in there, but I went on to the hospital ship Menunda, and there I only wanted a piece of bread and butter, and he gave us a pound loaf of butter and a pound loaf of pound loaf of bread and a pound of butter and a bottle of beer. And then we went and saw the nurses, and then we went to the Sussex, and we had a nice meal on the Sussex. And our friend over here went on the battleship. Some of them went on Lord Louis Mountbatten's battleship and spent the night there. And so it was a great time. But we all finished up coming back to Changi. And Changi then became a big city, and there was movement, people going home and all that sort of thing. But I have to say here, it was the atom bomb that saved their life. Because the orders had gone out in 1943, like in St Darkin, where they murdered the Australians, that in the event of invasion, every prisoner of war was to be shot. So that was the attitude right through. And then we just, I was on an aerodrome one day, and they said, do you want a quick flight home to Darwin? I said, no. I said, I've been here 3.5 years. I said, I'll wait for the ship. And so we sailed home on the Lark Bay and finished up at Brisbane. It was great to be free. It was great to be to enjoy the pleasures, and the little things, the simple things of life are most important. But now, look, I want to pay a tribute to the nurses who suffered so much and were not picked up until a month after the official surrender. The Japanese had sent them into the country in Sumatra and told nobody, and they were looking for them. And in that period, they formed a choir. Nora Chambers was in charge of the choir, and they had a great program. And in 1983, the survivors of the choir were invited to go to Washington to sing in the Peninsula Women's Choir, a 60-voice choir, and they sang the whole program of the music that had been created and written up and scored by Nora Chambers in the Palimang camp. Margaret Dryburgh was an English missionary, and this hymn has become immortal. She died in 1945, not long after, but this was sung every Sunday in 1942 until the numbers began to drop and they had to disband in the choir. I've got some music here. This is the original tape from the choir, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Here. It's not often one gets a chance to say something about the wives of we who were prisoners of war. Without them, many of us wouldn't be here today. And we thank them for their love and gracious mercy to us, especially those who love the Lord. We all go through our times of flashbacks, fights and arguments. It's an amazing thing, the memory. And we must learn to forgive, but it is hard to forget. Let me finish with this. Let us therefore, in our 50th year of peace, remember with a lasting gratitude and grateful hearts the sacrifice of those who gave their lives for us, and resolve to see that the freedom we enjoy today will be defended in the years to come, whatever the cost may be. Thank you.